Ray Holcomb had been farming the same ground for 31 years. He knew every low spot in his fields, every fence line that needed replacing, every drain tile that backed up after a heavy rain. He knew his equipment the same way, by sound, by feel, by the way a machine behaved when it was running right, and the way it behaved when something was quietly going wrong. 31 years of that kind of attention builds an instinct that no diagnostic computer can fully replicate, and Ray trusted his instincts the way most men trust their own name. So when his primary tractor started losing power on the heavy pulls that September, he knew before anyone told him that something real was happening inside that engine. Not a sensor, not a software glitch, something mechanical, something that had been building slowly across the season and had finally decided to announce itself during the worst possible stretch of calendar, the last push before harvest, when every hour of field time counted and downtime wasn't an inconvenience. It was a financial wound. He called the John Deere dealer first. That was the natural move. The tractor was green, the dealer was 40 minutes down the county road, and Ray had bought 3 machines from them across the years. He figured he'd get a service truck out to the farm, a quick diagnosis, maybe a week's turnaround if parts were needed. That was the expectation built from decades of the same relationship. You call the dealer handles it, you get back in the field. The service truck came out 2 days later. The technician connected the diagnostic reader, pulled the codes, did a visual inspection of the engine bay, and listened to the power loss Ray described. He was professional, thorough-looking, and didn't rush. Ray stood next to him and watched the whole process, asking questions, getting answers that sounded technically credible. By the end of the visit, the technician said he'd have a full report and repair estimate back to Ray within 48 hours. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon. Ray was in the machine shed when his phone rang. He stepped outside to take it, standing in the gravel lot between the shed and the barn, the kind of place where he'd taken 100 phone calls about equipment and seed and grain prices across the years. The service manager's voice was even, measured, the tone of someone who has learned to deliver expensive news without flinching. The diagnosis was severe. According to the dealer's assessment, the engine had suffered significant internal wear across multiple components. The report cited cylinder scoring, worn piston rings, and what the manager described as a compromised head gasket situation that had allowed coolant to contaminate the oil over an extended period. The recommended course of action was a full engine rebuild. The quote for parts and labor came to $9,400. The service manager added that given the machine's age and accumulated hours, the dealership's honest recommendation was to consider whether a rebuild made economic sense at all, or whether Ray would be better served trading the tractor toward a newer model. Ray stood in that gravel lot for a long moment after the call ended. $9,400. Or trade it. The tractor still had years of useful life left on it. Or at least Ray had believed that before the phone call. He'd kept up the maintenance schedule, changed the oil on time, replaced filters before they became problems. The machine had high hours, yes, but high hours on a well-maintained tractor and high hours on a neglected one are completely different animals, and Ray knew which one his was. Something didn't sit right. He couldn't have explained it precisely. It was the same instinct that told him a field was too wet to work before the tires ever confirmed it. The diagnosis felt like a conclusion that had been reached before the inspection was fully completed. He thought about the technician's visit. The man had been on the farm for about 90 minutes. He'd connected the reader, pulled codes, done a visual check, but Ray hadn't seen him do a compression test, hadn't seen him do an oil analysis on the spot, or pull a sample for lab work. The cylinder scoring diagnosis had come without anyone taking the head off the engine to actually look at the cylinders. The report was built on codes and visual observation and the technician's professional judgment, but professional judgment wasn't the same as physical evidence. Ray called his neighbor, a farmer named Glenn Tatum, who had switched from green equipment to Massey Ferguson about 8 years prior and hadn't looked back. Ray didn't ask Glenn about tractors or brands. He asked if Glenn knew a good independent mechanic who worked on mixed equipment, someone who wasn't attached to any dealership and didn't have a financial interest in any particular outcome. Glenn gave him a name. Not an independent mechanic exactly, but a Massey Ferguson service center about 42 miles away, run by a man named Earl Biddle, who had spent 20 years as a dealer technician before going independent. Earl's shop did warranty work for the local Massey dealer, but also took in all kinds of equipment, any brand, any age. Glenn said Earl was the kind of mechanic who wouldn't tell you something was broken if it wasn't, and wouldn't tell you it was fixable if it wasn't, and that in 40 years of farming, he'd never met another one quite like that. Ray loaded the tractor and hauled it to Earl's shop on a Friday morning. Earl Biddle was a quiet man, somewhere in his late 50s, with the kind of hands that have spent a lifetime inside engines. He didn't say much when Ray pulled the tractor off the trailer and walked him through the John Deere dealer's diagnostic report. He read the report carefully, asked 2 or 3 specific questions, and then went to work. Ray had brought a folding chair and sat outside the shop door with a cup of coffee, fully prepared to wait most of the day. He didn't need the whole day. An hour and 40 minutes after Earl started working, he came out of the shop and leaned against the door frame. "You want the long version or the short version?" he asked. Ray said he wanted both. Earl nodded. "Short version is your engine is fine. Long version takes about 10 minutes. Ray put down his coffee. What Earl had found had nothing to do with cylinder scoring or piston rings. The first thing he'd done, before anything else, before connecting a reader, before a visual, was pull an oil sample and examine it. The oil was dirty, but it wasn't contaminated with coolant. There was no milky discoloration, no sweet smell, no evidence of the head gasket breach the John Deere dealer had cited. The coolant in the cooling system was low, but the reservoir was intact. The levels were down because of a slow external weep from a hose fitting, not because it was going somewhere internal. The power loss that had sent Ray to the dealer in the first place traced back to 2 separate but compounding issues, neither of which required an engine rebuild. The first was a failing fuel injection pump, not catastrophically failed, not seized, but degraded enough that fuel delivery was inconsistent under load, which produced exactly the kind of power loss Ray had been experiencing on heavy pulls. The second was a clogged fuel return line that was creating back pressure in the system, making the injection pump work harder than it should and accelerating its wear. Earl replaced the fuel injection pump with a quality aftermarket unit and cleaned and pressure tested the fuel return line. He also replaced the weeping hose fitting on the cooling system and topped the fluid levels. Parts and labor came to $840. The tractor ran better, leaving Earl's shop than it had in 2 full seasons. Ray sat in the truck on the drive home with the tractor on the trailer behind him and did the math in his head. The difference between what the John Deere dealer had quoted him and what Earl had actually charged was $8,560. That was a number that didn't shrink the longer he thought about it. It just sat there, flat and enormous, the financial equivalent of a field that had been plowed in the wrong direction. He thought about what the service manager had said. Consider whether the rebuild makes economic sense. Consider trading toward a newer model. At $9,400, a rebuild would have been difficult to justify on a tractor of that age and hours. The trade-in route would have put Ray into a new loan at a moment when his margins were already narrow and the harvest season was pressing down on him. Either path the dealer had laid out would have cost him far more than $840, and neither one was necessary. Ray wasn't a man who used words like betrayal lightly. He understood that service businesses made their money on labor and parts, that technicians worked under pressure to turn around diagnoses quickly, and that errors in assessment were sometimes genuine and not always malicious. But he also understood that the outcome was the same, regardless of the cause. He had been handed a report that recommended spending nearly $10,000 on a machine that needed less than $900 of work. Whether that came from incompetence or from a business model that profited from expensive outcomes, the result for the farmer holding the invoice was identical. He told Glenn about it that evening. Glenn listened without interrupting and at the end said simply, "That's why I switched." Ray didn't say anything back. He just drove home. The harvest that year went clean. The tractor ran through every acre without complaint, the injection pump performing the way it should have been performing for the 2 seasons the clogged return line had been suppressing it. Ray finished his own harvest and then picked up a neighbor's custom combining work that added 3 weeks to his season. Work he wouldn't have been able to take on if he'd been dealing with an engine rebuild or sitting in a dealership financing office negotiating a trade. Word got around the way it always did in farming communities, slowly and thoroughly. Ray hadn't made a point of telling the story at the co-op or the elevator, but he'd mentioned it to the people who asked why he'd been hauling his tractor across county lines. And those people had mentioned it to others, and by the time the first snow fell that November, most of the operators within a 20-mile radius had heard some version of what had happened. The John Deere dealer didn't reach out to Ray to discuss it. No call from the service manager, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that the diagnosis had been wrong. The silence was in some ways more telling than anything the dealer could have said. A business that had made an honest mistake and caught it early would have called. A business that hadn't caught the mistake because nobody was looking to catch it. That business went quiet and hoped the customer didn't talk too loudly. Ray switched his service work to Earl's shop entirely. He still ran green equipment. He wasn't ready to liquidate his fleet over a single incident. But when Earl could work on it, it went to Earl. Warranty work that required a dealer went to a different John Deere dealer 2 counties over. No announcement. He just quietly changed where his money went. The following spring, Ray walked into the Massey Ferguson dealership closest to Earl's shop. His planning tractor was aging, and he wanted to understand his options before a rushed decision forced his hand. The salesman didn't try to close him. When Ray mentioned what had happened with the diagnostic report, he didn't use it as a pitch. He just said, "That's what happens when the incentive is to find the most expensive answer, not the right one." Ray bought a Massey Ferguson planting tractor that spring. Not because of the diagnostic story alone. The price and specifications made sense independent of anything that had happened in the fall. But the experience had shifted something in how he thought about brand loyalty. Loyalty built on habit and familiarity was a different thing from loyalty built on performance and honest dealing. He'd spent 31 years assuming those were the same. They weren't. The summer that followed brought a drought that hit the county hard, compressing margins across every operation that ran on row crops. Ray watched his neighbors navigate it and noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. The farmers who were financially resilient going into the drought were the ones who had kept their equipment costs contained across the previous few years. Not the ones with the newest machines or the shiniest fleet. The ones who had made decisions based on actual numbers rather than brand habit or sales pressure. Earl Biddle became something of a fixture in Ray's operation after that. Not just a mechanic who worked on his equipment, but a reference point, someone whose technical opinion Ray could bring a problem to and get an answer that wasn't shaped by what answer would generate the most revenue. That kind of relationship, Ray came to understand, was rarer and more valuable than any warranty package or dealer network coverage map. By the end of that second season, Ray had 3 pieces of Massey Ferguson equipment running alongside his older green machines. Not because he'd made a philosophical commitment to any particular brand, but because the combination of Earl's independent service relationship and the Massey dealership's approach had consistently produced better outcomes per dollar spent than what he'd experienced in the green network over the previous decade. He didn't think of himself as someone who had changed allegiances. He thought of himself as someone who had finally started paying attention to the actual numbers instead of the inherited assumptions. 31 years of farming had given him the instinct to know when a field wasn't ready and when an engine didn't sound right. The $9,400 quote that turned into an $840 repair had given him something harder to teach. The instinct to know when a business relationship wasn't working in his interest, and the willingness to drive 42 miles to find out for certain. His son, Marcus, was 24 that year and beginning to take on more responsibility around the operation. One evening, Ray told him the story in full, not as a cautionary tale exactly, but as a lesson in how to evaluate information when the person providing it has a financial stake in the outcome. Get a second opinion on anything that costs more than you can afford to be wrong about, Ray told him. And find the people who tell you what's true, even when true is cheaper than what they could charge you for. Marcus asked which dealer he should trust. Ray thought about it for a moment. Don't start with which dealer. Start with which mechanic. The mechanic is the one who's actually looking at the machine. The dealer is the building the mechanic works inside. Those are two different things. That distinction between the institution and the individual, between the brand on the sign and the hands on the engine, was one that Ray had learned the expensive way, or almost the expensive way. The fact that he'd trusted his instinct and made a 42-mile drive before writing a check was the only reason the lesson had cost him $840 instead of $9,400. The tractor the John Deere dealer had told him was done continued working Ray's fields for 4 more seasons after Earl fixed it in an afternoon. The injection pump Earl had installed outlasted its warranty period without issue. The cooling hose fitting never caused another problem. The machine that had been presented as an economic liability turned out to be one of the most reliable pieces of equipment in Ray's shed, not from any exceptional quality, but simply because the actual problem had been correctly identified and properly fixed. The John Deere dealer never knew any of this. As far as their records showed, Ray Holcomb had declined the repair and gone elsewhere. They didn't follow up to find out where. In a county where farming operations talk to each other constantly, that lack of curiosity was its own kind of answer. The same thinking that had produced the $9,400 quote in the first place. In the springs that followed, Ray would sometimes think about the chain of events that had almost played out differently. An emergency loan taken under pressure, the worst kind of financial decision, made when options are narrowest. A repair bill for something that wasn't broken. The actual problem left in place, degrading until the machine went down again at the next worst possible moment. The turn had been right there. The natural move, the step most operators would have taken without a second thought, was to say yes to the dealer and get the machine back to work. The cost of questioning the diagnosis was a 42-mile drive. The cost of not questioning it would have been everything downstream of a wrong repair. Earl Biddle didn't treat it as any kind of triumph. When Ray mentioned the difference between Earl's bill and the dealer's quote, Earl just nodded and said, "Misdiagnosis happened more than people thought, especially when the diagnostic process was built around pulling codes and cross-referencing a repair database rather than starting with physical observation and working backward from what the machine was actually doing." "The codes tell you where to look," Earl said. "They don't tell you what you'll find when you get there. Some people forget that the look is the job, not reading the code." By the 4th year, 2/3 of Ray's primary equipment was Massey Ferguson. Not from loyalty in the new direction, he'd learned enough from old loyalty to distrust that feeling, but from a practical accounting of where maintenance costs had run lower, service relationships more reliable, and downtime least. His neighbor on the east fence line, a man named Darrell Phipps, who had run green equipment his entire career and whose father had before him, watched Ray's fleet change over without commenting directly. One afternoon in the fall of the 4th year, Darrell stopped his truck at the fence line while Ray was moving equipment and rolled down his window. "That the Massey that replaced your old planter?" Darrell asked. "One of them," Ray said. Darrell was quiet for a moment. "You happy with it?" "I'm happy with the bill at the end of the year," Ray said. "That's what I'm keeping track of." Darrell nodded slowly, said nothing else, rolled his window up and drove on. But the following spring, a Massey Ferguson sat in Darrell's equipment yard. Newer model, dealer tags still on it. Darrell never mentioned it, and Ray never asked. Some things in farming communities get communicated without words. The John Deere dealer that had given Ray the $9,400 quote was still in business, the service manager presumably still making similar calls to other farmers. Ray didn't know how many of them had driven 42 miles for a second opinion, and how many had simply written the check. He suspected the ratio wasn't in the farmer's favor. What stayed with Ray most uncomfortably wasn't anger at what had almost happened. It was the quiet certainty that it was happening continuously in counties across the country, to operators too busy or too pressured by the calendar to question the first answer. The farming industry ran on trust. Most of that trust was earned. But trust without verification, when the person you trusted had a financial interest in a particular outcome, wasn't trust. It was exposure. The tractor that had started all of this was still in Ray's shed when he finally handed the operation over to Marcus. Still running, still reliable, still carrying the injection pump that Earl Biddle had installed on a Friday afternoon for $840, while 42 miles away a service department had a work order open for a $9,400 engine rebuild that never happened. Marcus asked about it once, why the tractor had a non-original injection pump when everything else in its service records looked consistent. Ray told him the whole story. The Thursday afternoon phone call, the drive to Earl's shop, the number on the invoice at the end of the day. Marcus listened and then said, "So the dealer was wrong." Ray shook his head. "The dealer gave me an answer. I almost didn't check whether the answer was right. That's different." It was the most important distinction Ray had learned in 35 years of farming. Not that dealers could be wrong, which any experienced operator already knew, but that the responsibility for checking belonged to the farmer. The machine was his, the money was his, the decision was his. Everyone else in the transaction had their own interests, their own reasons to reach a particular conclusion. The only person whose interests were purely aligned with getting the right answer for the lowest necessary cost was the man who owned the equipment and would live with the outcome. $840, or $9,400. The difference wasn't just a number. It was the distance between a 42-mile drive and a phone call. It was the space between one afternoon and the assumption that the first answer was the only answer. It was the gap between trusting a relationship and trusting the evidence. Ray Holcomb had driven the 42 miles. Not every farmer would. Not every farmer did. But for the ones who did, for the ones who understood that looking closer before writing the check was always worth doing, that drive was the most profitable one they ever made.